Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Movies and Us, a weekly gathering place filled with conversations about movies, stories, and connection. My name is Jennifer Hahn.
And I'm Sarah Callan.
And today we are continuing A24 August with the film The Souvenir. Okay, Sarah, do you want to kick us off with an IMDb summary for The Souvenir?
Sure. A young film student in the early 80s becomes romantically involved with a complicated and untrustworthy man.
This bodes well.
Yeah, nothing's going to go wrong with this story.
When the two adjectives that someone describes you as is complicated and untrustworthy, you know you've been doing something wrong.
Yeah, there's some red flags in that sentence.
Yes. Okay, let's start off with our one-sentence summaries for The Souvenir. What was yours?
Mine is just say no to heroin and arrogance.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. More red flags to add to the collection here.
We have a very large collection going here, and I'm sure that we will gather some more as we talk.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. My one-sentence summary is relational trauma is the only souvenir he gave her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're not wrong.
Nice little collection for her lifetime. Oh, okay.
Poor thing.
I'm excited to talk about this movie with you. I'm very curious your thoughts about this film and if it worked for you. So in this first section, we will not spoil this movie. We'll include a spoiler and then we'll have full reign. But high-level thoughts, Sarah, what did you think about The Souvenir?
Jen, I am so conflicted about this movie.
Oh my gosh. I love when you're conflicted because then we get to pick it apart. Let's unpack.
I hated watching this movie.
Mm-hmm.
This was almost to the level of how I felt while watching White Noise. This is a far better movie than White Noise.
Wow.
But my struggle to watch this movie was similar to that.
Really?
Yeah. I kept getting up to like go get a snack or like go wash the dishes or something. Like I wanted to get out of this world. And so what I started to do about like halfway through the movie is I just started focusing on like individual technical aspects of this film. And then it became much more enjoyable to watch. It was my survival tactic, is getting like tunnel vision for this movie.
Goodness.
And I love so many of the components of this. I think that the cinematography is wonderful. It's stunning.
Sumptuous.
Yes, it's just so good. The score is very evocative. The performances are good. So like the individual components of this movie are just great.
Mm-hmm.
And I hated every second of watching it. Mm-hmm. So I'm very conflicted. What I realized today, because I watched it yesterday, so like today as I was just like reflecting on the movie and reflecting on my experience watching it, I think it triggered me just a little bit. There are some similarities between the relationship depicted and my parents' relationship growing up. And so I think I was a little bit triggered, and that contributed to my negative experience of watching this film. So today I've just been like reflecting on how we always bring ourselves to a film, like as unbiased and as like blank of a canvas as we try to be when we watch a film. You can never completely do that. And so I probably reacted more strongly to this film just because what I have observed in my life and how I responded to those situations. And so that's just been interesting to think about how this, and so I think this film is very effective because it got me to feel things so strongly and have such a strong reaction to it. So on the one hand, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a really great film. On the other hand, I'm like, I never want to watch this ever again. So I'm feeling very conflicted about it. That's kind of where I'm at.
your brain and your heart just going to battle, and your brain was your survival technique tactic for
I
this
mean, let's be
movie.
honest, it always is the survival tactic because you just get myopic and you
Hmm.
just focus on little things and you're
Hmm.
good.
Hmm. But I think you bring up a really great point, which is that this film is so effective, and that's why it tugged on those heartstrings and hit those spots for you. Like
Mhm.
in a lot of
Yeah.
ways, something that is maybe more melodramatic can feel a little bit distant, but there's something so honest and rooted in and grounded about this movie, and the way that those difficult moments are portrayed too, that I think may have also been part of that equation for you as well. Like there's not a I don't know. I feel like in Hollywood, we've seen our fair share of toxic relationships.
Mhm.
And they're often incredibly overdramatic. And there's something that is almost menacing about how unassuming this toxic relationship is filmed, and filmed so beautifully too. So that's this really
Yeah.
interesting pairing and tension between those two things that come together.
Yeah. Yeah. It's wild
Yeah.
how beautiful this film is and how uh deeply
Horrifying. Yeah.
unhealthy
Yeah.
their relationship is. It's
Yeah.
such an interesting juxtaposition.
Yes. Yes. As time has gone by, I think that there's just so many layers to this film, and on a first time watch, I think I felt like there's just so much that will deepen with time and probably with second viewings, because there's this is this film is overstimulating in a lot of ways, and yet it is so unassuming, and that tension together is really fascinating to experience. This film is also incredibly melancholy. It's a mood piece in a lot of ways. Um, I think we've seen a couple of films this month by A24 that really feel like visual poetry to me, and this is squarely in that category as well. It's not filmed with the traditional narrative structure at all. In a lot of ways, it feels like these series of vignettes and this camera observing these little moments of these people's daily lives, and both the mundane moments, but also these incredibly dramatic moments. But it's all told through such an earnest lens that I don't know that there's I felt like sucked into this world, and it's a it's just tough to watch this woman go through so much. Um, I was also fascinated by just the way that my feelings about these characters shifted and change and evolve, like scene to scene. So I think that was like pretty interesting and effective that this film does as well.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot going on in this, and you might not necessarily expect it.
Hmm.
It seems like, oh, we're just watching these people live their lives, but there's a lot more here than meets the eye. And
Yeah.
I think it's also fascinating to me that this is based on
Yes.
the director and writer Joanna Hogg, her life, like an experience that she had when she
Yeah.
was a student at film school. And so I think because of that distance, she's able to put maybe some emotions and some perspective on this, uh, to create those moments of melancholy and I don't know, just shooting these really, really difficult moments in the way that she does, with both empathy for Julie, but also this like harsh reality of the difficult moments of it. This is a very complex piece. And I feel like all of these technical filmmaking components come together to create just an interesting swirl of what this moment in this character Julie's life was like.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. This feels like a film, and I'm trying to think about the last film that made me feel this way, but I think needs time to sit and to sink into that one viewing. I don't think it does this justice. Like there's so much here, and I just think there needs time for it just to like seep in. And I only watched it like, yeah, I finished it last night, and so I've just been mulling on so many of the aspects of this, and oh, there's just so much there. But I think there's time needed for it to deepen and to really seep in. And I'm trying to think about the last film that really made me feel that way. It's kind of rare.
Mm-hmm. Because I feel like a lot of the times when we're like, oh my gosh, we need to watch this again, it's like something like Oppenheimer, where it's just you've been assaulted in your senses and you want to go in to see like
Yes.
the pieces of the film that you missed. But I feel like this is something different. Like it needs time to marinate, is really what
Yes.
it is.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think I, I think that's so interesting because this was created, decades after she had this experience. And so
Mm-hmm.
she has had years to work through things and see these experiences in a new light. And it's interesting that she was able to, on some level, recreate that for us as well as the audience. And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's a really special thing that I don't know how she managed to do that, but
Right.
she sure
Right.
did. And I, like you, I can't remember the last time we had that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's actually, I think, a incredibly far more challenging task for such an emotional moment of your life to be able to communicate the nuances of it in the way that she does. I think about another film like Minari, which is fabulous and wonderful, but there is a nostalgia, there's a glossy lens that, hindsight and looking back on your younger self often will sometimes create for you. Just you remember the certain aspects, and we ourselves create narratives for our own selves. Like our own stories are a narrative to us, and that's how we've processed things and whatnot. But there are so many moments in this film that are a short little scene that I feel like in and of itself there's so much to unpack. There's little nuances in the conversation or the facial expressions, or the little annoyances that then fade away, or the little moments of sweetness that then also fade away in the next scene. That um, it's all unassuming, and yet this there's so much that happens and yet is done in such an unassuming way that I think is just really in line, and feels very grounded with the way that our day-to-day lives often look in those little moments and those little conversations uh, that she somehow captured. And then the other interesting thing that I think this film does, which also I think requires that longer marination time, is there's there's a level of effort and work that the film trusts us to be able to be willing to put in. And so there's less of the connective tissue that we often see in like a traditional narrative film where we go from scene to scene. It's very clear how one thing has led to the next scene. This, in a lot of ways, feels like the collection of juxtaposing moments. And between those moments are where we find the meaning, not necessarily in one moment individually, but the fact that they're paired together feels significant. Those two things were cut next to each other or cut in a succession with each other. And what does that thread mean? That's where I think that this movie's like the film version of like reading between the lines, and that feels incredibly exciting and fun. But I think it also takes time to really appreciate and go to those depths with this film, which is why I'm just excited to watch it again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. It also feels like somebody's memory. Um, in some
Mm,
ways, it reminds me of Come On, Come On, which really felt like just a series of memories. Um, and I think what's so fascinating about the souvenir is the way that characters are positioned in the frame. So like especially at the beginning of the film, we don't see Antony's face for
Yes.
the longest time.
Yes.
And I think those things are so interesting because it, at least to me, like it speaks to how we remember things. We remember weird details of what we have gone through. And so I love those little things, or, you know, sometimes somebody will be speaking, but the camera is not on them. The camera is focused on something completely different, because that is what is important to the memory. And I think even to what you were saying, like we don't always remember things in a linear fashion. We don't always remember uh, even like full days necessarily. We might remember just this little cutout from the day, this one interaction, and that is the important thing that stands out to us. So it's fascinating to be just sifting through this woman's memories of this relationship.
Yeah. No, that's so true. And I think that the other filmmaking aspect of this around the score that you mentioned and the cinematography,
Oh,
like
yes.
this film is incredibly grounded in a lot of ways and it's unassuming, and yet there is this like fantasy like gleam on top of all of it. You know, like so many of those shots of the landscape or the florals or a field are so um it's a mood piece. That there's just so many moments that get us into a headspace, and then we kind of view the next succession of scenes through that lens. So I feel like um, as grounded and subtle and nuanced those moments and depictions of their lives are, there's also this aspect that also feels larger than life as well. And it's difficult for a film to hold those two tensions to be true at the same time. You know, like that is fascinating to me. And like you mentioned with not being able to see Anthony for a long time, he is just this kind of looming figure. This kind of we sense the danger and the foreboding of what's to come, but he's almost this larger than life figure in a lot of ways. His presence comes and goes, and I don't know that I felt that fantasy esque framing in a lot of scenes here, while it also be being about just like these little vignettes of them like making a meal together. Like, how can the film do both? This somehow accomplishes that.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. But it does have that, and I feel like that's part of what helps us feel like this is a memory, or feel like
Yeah.
we have been transported back in time. You know,
Mm,
I loved uh, just how grainy the film looks, and how desaturated it is. It really made me feel like we were in a different time, in a different place. And I don't know, again, like just all of the filmmaking components come together to create this whole different world that we inhabit for a couple of hours. It's very, very effective.
yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's include a spoiler alert. If you haven't seen The Souvenir, we recommend checking out. It's available on Paramount Plus with a Showtime edition add on. So we recommend watching before continuing to listen. Okay, where shall we go first?
Where would you like to go?
Ah, I don't even know. You know, in a lot of ways, okay, this is I feel like in a lot of ways my thoughts are still forming about this film, which
Mm-hmm.
usually doesn't happen often with me. Like there's usually a lot of like gut reactions and things and whatnot, but I feel like this film is still seeping into my brain and there's so much to explore.
I'm sorry that I'm of no help.
No, it's
Because
okay.
I think I viewed this like now that I've it's been a minute. It's been over 24 hours since I watched it. I can appreciate all of these things, but like when I was watching it, I was like, he is a creep. You need him to leave. Like that was just me, like the whole movie.
Mm.
So like, I don't know, outside of the filmmaking components that we've just gushed about for 20 minutes, uh, that's
That was the
the
prevailing thought.
best thing that I took away from this, which is just fascinating. I think as I was watching this, I viewed this, I don't know, I wasn't looking for themes. I was just like, I need you to kick him out of your apartment. This is not healthy. Just say no. Which is,
It
you
was like,
know,
"You suck, please leave." Also,
yes.
wow, look at that shot. Oh, wow, look at that score.
Honestly,
Oh, wow,
like
look at this framing.
that's all my notes is he's a creep, gross, I don't like him, you can do better, and
Mm.
also this is gorgeous, this score. Like it was just, my notes are a weird mix of things.
Mm. Yeah, I let's talk well, do we wanna talk about the characters?
I don't know, we can go wherever you want to go.
Okay. What I was struck by, because I read the premise of this film before watching this, and, I was like, "Okay, here we go. We know the story. Tried and true," you know? Um, tale as old as time. But I was, I think, impressed by the way that this film didn't feel like it fell into the same stereotypical traps that this type of story typically falls into, um,
Mm-hmm.
which it has all of the hallmarks of it right there. But I found that typically in the like toxic relationship stories, there's a lot of empathy we have for um, the main character, the Julie, whatever the Julie character would typically be in that relationship, and then obviously there's clear hatred and villainy for the abusive other part of the relationship. But I felt like this film did an interesting job of showcasing that they are both incredibly human. Like I didn't feel the same like um outpouring of sympathy and whatnot for Julie, and I also didn't feel the same like typical rage fest that we have. I just feel like there was a pretty balanced and sober minded perspective on both of them, and that was fascinating to me. Like there's moments where Julie was frustrating to me, like
Mm-hmm.
the
Yeah.
scenes where she's asking her parents for money because she's covering up, like there's moments where she is difficult, and then there's moments where like she is just a child getting swindled by this person and taken advantage of by this power dynamic. And similarly with Anthony, I mean, he's obviously clearly from the beginning just an absolute terror, but he's also an addict, and then that plays into everything else of the way that he makes some of the choices, and it colors some of the choices that he's made previously in the film that um in a typical toxic relationship, like, yeah, that's not okay, but everything is colored a little bit differently, knowing that there's a desperation and like a headspace that he's in that is he needs help too, and I just thought that was surprising to me. It's not the story I expected. I thought this would be um, more in line with the rest of the melodramas that we've seen around toxic relationships, and I think that this film is oddly sober-minded about it, which again is, I think, interesting because it's semi-autobiographical. It'd be so easy for her to tell the story a certain way, and she is the protagonist of her own life and also this story, and for her to create such a balanced perspective on these two people, one of them being herself, I think is just really interesting.
Yeah, and I really think at least part of that just comes with time. you know? Like, she's had a while to learn to have grace for her younger self, but also probably sees the real life Antony character in a different light rather than how she would have seen herself and him, 5, 10,
Mm-hmm.
20 years after. It's
Yeah.
been a little while, and I also think it's so interesting. I'm not sure what parts of this are hold true for what actually happened, but if Joanna Hogg's version of Antony really did pass away, then there's not another side to refute. So if there's not that other party to say, like, hey, that's not accurate to what happened, it might be tempting to paint the character version of you as the protagonist, and make the man the villain, and she doesn't. And there's still grace and empathy for Antony even when he is being awful, and that is it definitely differentiates this movie from so many others in the genre.
Yeah, there's a wisdom in being able to create a film like this about your own
Yeah.
life, and
Yeah.
the emotional work, like you mentioned, that she must have done to process, to be willing to see herself and him clearly, like, gosh, that at a meta level, this is impressive. Beyond just the filmmaking and the execution of this as a piece of art, but knowing the backstory and how close to home this is for the creator, gosh, that is yet, more points on the board for Joanna Hogg, and be able to create a film like this about yourself.
Yeah, and the humility to not make yourself the hero.
Yeah.
Wild. Like, the
We're so good
restraint
at
to do
self-delusion as human
that.
beings,
It's
and
true.
it's it's so tempting. It's how we process all of our lived experiences is in the narrative as it pertains to us, and it would be very convenient for her to, like you said, paint ourselves as a victim and him as the villain. But we've seen that story a million times over, so I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, this is much more complex and complicated and truer to life.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have clear distinctions of good and bad, though obviously the film is like, hey, some of these things are not okay. But it's not necessarily that this person is
Yeah.
good, this person is bad.
Yeah.
But we are all mixes of a lot of different things, and we see that
Mm-hmm.
complexity here.
One of the moments that I thought was really interesting, and again, I think it's this little example. This film is like littered. It's just basically moment after moment like this, but it's when they go to see the painting that he had on the card for her, and she's looking at it and she says, "Oh, she looks sad in the painting," and he goes, "She looks determined," and I'm just like, those two lines alone say so much about how they see each other and how she sees herself. You know what I mean? Like, there's so much to unpack in just those few little lines, and that's how I feel about like nearly every line in this movie. That there's so much meaning and weightiness in what this says about their dynamic. Um, that's just one example that like really stuck out to me of uh, so efficiently communicating both uh, about these two characters, about their dynamic together, and that coloring kind of what we see for the rest of the film. I think that moment happens pretty early on.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that, and this is the neat thing about art too, like you were mentioning, at a meta level, that is also commentary about art and the way that we all see ourselves or our own points of view about the world through the art that we see, we superimpose it on there. There's the meta point about art too, and just that one little moment. Like that is this film in a nutshell.
No, that's so good. And there are so many moments like that all throughout this
Right.
movie. And I feel like every moment is such like a character revealing moment.
Yes. Yes.
You learn so much about these characters, but it's all through little interactions like that. And so if you're paying attention, you can glean so much from that. It's more than just them looking at a painting or them eating dinner or whatever it is. But I love how intentional this film is, and all of these things carry so much meaning, uh, and also give you context for future interactions, future moments. That's great. So
Mhm.
intentional.
Yeah. Yeah, all those little vignettes like her interactions with her family and this family dynamics too. Like I think there's just so much to lift out and glean from those. And it's so funny because I feel like this episode's going to be like an hour of us being like, I don't know how to talk about this movie because there just is so much. Like it is so dense and rich
Yeah.
and sumptuous that I'm like, we could talk about one scene for an hour at this movie because there is so much there, like you're mentioning. So it is densely packed.
Okay, one of my favorite moments
Okay.
that I loved, just oh, it got me so good, was it's almost the last bit of the movie, and
Okay.
she is in the studio. They're filming that final scene, and our camera that we're viewing through can see everything, actress, director, and then in front of her is the camera and the cameraman. And then as the camera that we are watching pans in, the camera people pan in toward the actress. So for
Mm,
a minute there, Julie is covered up by the camera and the camera people. And then eventually they move out of the way and our camera continues to pan in on her face. And I think that not only is gorgeous visually, it was so fun because she's standing still and there's so much movement and visual interest on screen. It's fantastic. But I think there's also something there about like how a filmmaker, like you can see them through their film, and if you push past another layer then you can really see them. And I think because this is semi autobiographical,
mm.
it's really this like, yes, I'm revealing this film to you, but I'm also revealing myself. I'm revealing who I used to be through this. So I feel like even in like this really cool
Oh my goodness.
choreographed
Wow.
moment, there's
Yeah.
all of this meaning too. Oh,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's so cool.
Mm-hmm. That's insane. Yeah. I didn't even notice that one, but like, wow. Wow, wow, wow. One of the, on a similar vein, I think one of the things that visually was really fascinating to me is how much there are shots with reflective surfaces throughout the
Yes.
film. Mirrors, windows, just so many. And the shot is framed where oftentimes we're actually watching the interaction between the characters happen on the reflective surface more than we're actually watching the characters um, in their human form. And I thought that there was like just an interesting like meta commentary there around like we are observing them through a lens and the filmmaker has framed that lens to be a specific way. And so that idea of just like observation, like as a viewer of a film, like we are kind of in these moments observing things that technically we shouldn't really be seeing, but we've gotten a glimpse the way that we've gotten a glimpse through a mirrored surface of this incredibly intimate moment between these two people that have no idea that we as the viewer are there, but we are there and we are seeing it and experiencing it like that 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 you know idea of seeing and being in a moment that we aren't known to be in is kind of an interesting theme throughout this film. And that in a lot of ways is what film is in general. Like we're basically in places that we should never be throughout film.
Yeah.
Like we're just hanging around characters, following them around. We're stalking characters, and they have no idea that we're just observing their most intimate lives. Uh, but that idea of observation, I thought was really interesting.
We're just adding more red flags to the bucket, but this time we
Yes,
are the red flags, not
yes,
Anthony.
we're a walking red flag. Yes,
Oh no.
yeah,
But I think what I also love, because in Julie's flat, her little wall of mirrors is that half wall that separates her like dining table from the kitchen.
yeah,
And I loved the way that that little half wall separating these two rooms was used.
mm,
Absolutely brilliant, because you can
mm-hmm.
see these two people, they are together, but they are also separate, and there's something dividing them. And you can see how they react when they're on the same side of the wall, and then you can see
Yeah,
how they react when they're on different sides of the wall. And so,
yeah,
again, like all of these things point
so good.
to who these characters are. And I feel like when you see them on either side of the wall, you can learn about so much about each of them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that that was always really effective and came at really important times in the film when we saw
Yeah,
that little split screen situation. It was great.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's a point where that mirrored wall is shattered too. There's a large crack in it, and I think it's after
Mm-hmm.
one of their big fights or whatnot. And the shots in that space afterwards are framed where that that crack is refracting the ability for us to see our characters clearly too, and it's like this foreboding presence in the frame. I wasn't even looking at the characters, I was just staring at this crack, um because of the way that shot is framed to be like such a reminder of what had transpired here. Like that the looming presence of that crack was very large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and there's probably something in there too about like how difficult those things can be to repair.
And yeah, yeah. Wow. We just need to pick a scene and go on a little trail, little side trail, and then pick another one
Honestly.
and just for real though, we could do this like minute by minute analysis of
Oh
the
yeah,
souvenir, I swear. Oh my
absolutely.
goodness. So
There's
wild.
there's a lot to this.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing that after the film ended, I was like, man, I did not have the brain space to really focus on some of these details, but I will the second time around. Is the echoing of moments where she's filming her film and the way that comments on or is in conversation with her day to day reality. This is something that Drive My Car does incredibly effectively. Birdman, they're creators and artists, and they're cutting back and forth and showing moments of whatever art that they're creating, and that being kind of in conversation with what's happening in their day-to-day life. So I'm sure there's so much there too where I was like, wow, there's a whole ripe field over there that I didn't even have time to think about and really dive into, but I'm sure that there's a lot there as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is really interesting, kind of in conversation with what all of the film school teachers are telling Julie about her
Yeah.
film, that she needs to
Mm-hmm.
create something that's a little closer to her lived experience. So that would probably be really interesting to focus on
Yeah.
and see how that plays out. And then again, like with this bigger, like meta narrative about Julie is getting this feedback that she should create something closer to her lived experience, where this is a movie that is semi-autobiographical, you know? So I think that that's a
Yes.
fun little thing to think about too in this
Mm-hmm.
part of the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Man, there are these also like moments which I loved, which are just like musings from her about what film means to her. You know, there's one that I loved that you and I have talked about so frequently around um, film being a way to entertain, but also to communicate. And she has a little mini monologue that in one of her early, like, I think at home dates with Antony, that is almost that word for word. And I just, the dopamine hit my brain. I just love that little moment. But um, I wonder how much those musings from Julie as a character are reflective of Joanna Hogg's perspectives about film at that time in her life, and how that is either sustained or evolved as she's grown as an artist as well. But I thought those felt so intentional as well. Like this is a philosophical perspective that she's also sharing about her perspective on film as a medium and as an art form.
First off, I just love movies about filmmakers. Like, they're just so fun.
Mhm.
Can we just get more like great filmmakers just making movies about movies? Because it's a good time.
The industry loves it too.
The industry does love it, and I'm here for it. I'm not
Hmm.
mad at it at all.
Yep.
If it creates something that's really good, which
Yeah.
sometimes it is.
Hmm.
But okay, so something fascinating that I read after watching this movie was that um, Honor Swinton Byrne, who plays Julie, wasn't given a script. uh Joanna Hogg just gave her old like diaries, notes, all of that stuff so that she
Oh
could
my goodness.
immerse herself in this character, and then she just like reacted to the scenes.
Oh
Basically
my
everybody else had a
goodness.
script, and so they tried to like play off of what she did, but a lot of it was just her reacting as Julie, not following
Wow.
lines on a script. That's what IMDb said. I like to believe that that's correct because that's freaking incredible. What a way to make a
Mm.
movie,
Hmm.
which is just wild, you know? And even going back to like if I were making a movie about my life, I would want a large degree of control in that.
Hmm.
But like to just release that and say, here, you become Julie, you become this character, this is what you base it off of, and then just be true to Julie. That is wild.
And the amount of trust that that takes of the
Yeah.
actor, but also the amount of like intimacy to just open up your
Yeah.
life, not just your life, actually, just you as a human being up to this person. And um, I think also, like we mentioned earlier, but just the tendency to want to like jump in and be like, oh well, that's actually not how it was, or like you lived through that, so the tension there of like allowing this to take its life on its own, but also still feel resonant with your lived experiences is like a, when do you take in those reins? When do you let them loose and let the art just be created as it does organically? It's got kind of an interesting, uh, exercise of discernment as well as a creator too. To like, there's a version of this that is so curated to try and fit her lived experiences that kind of stifles the emotion and the moment of it, right? And then there's, on the other hand, where it does take a life on its own and no longer feels as resonant. I don't know, that's just like an interesting uh scenario to find yourself in.
Right? That's wild.
Man, that is crazy. Wow.
Yeah. like honestly, more and more, I'm just very impressed with Joanna Hogg. Like, did not enjoy my experience watching this movie, but holy crap, she is phenomenal. Like, wow, let's celebrate her.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I also was thinking about how the the choice to share that this is semi-autobiographical in and of itself is pretty interesting too. You know what I mean? Like there might be understanding of that comes to light for those that really do the research and put the time and attention, or maybe those that are in your circle that know you deeply, that know how much this is truly semi-autobiographical, but to share that so openly as part of the framing of the film itself is also just an interesting, like, I don't want to call it a marketing choice because that feels like the wrong term for it, but to share that with the world and to position it that way is also just like a interesting choice for how it's received, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't
That
know
plays
that
into that too.
that level of vulnerability
Yeah.
is wild to me
Yeah. Yeah.
because we get so many based on a true story movies. Those are a dime a dozen. But this is something completely different. This is like bearing your soul on
Yes.
film.
Yes. Yeah. This is in a different category than like Meet the Fablemans, Minari, that are
Yeah.
the protagonist is clearly the protagonist and the hero of the story, and it is nostalgic. It is full of like rose-colored glasses moments, and there's something sweet and endearing about that as well. But you're right, the amount of vulnerability it takes to bear your soul and your life story in this way, and some of the choices that you made in your past just fully on screen in such a vulnerable way. Man.
Yeah.
And then
Mhm.
to do a second follow-up movie to that.
Right?
Let's talk about
Wow.
that for a hot sec before we have to hit on that. I mean, I was making fun of that leading up to our recording. We're like, why does this need a sequel? But
Yeah.
actually, after the movie wrapped up, I was like, these characters are so complex and full of life, not in the traditional sense of the word, but full of just like lived experience that I could see there being a second movie because there is so much more to this person. This feels like getting to know a person. So yeah, I want to know what happens next in her story, you know? Um, there's a clear ending to this story, but I think like Julie, like how does she heal? What does she do next? How does this frame her choices for her life? How does this frame and inform her art? Like all of those are open questions that I think in and of itself would be really interesting to explore because the characters are complex enough that there's so much there. Like we've just skimmed the surface of her life. Like what does she do next? I want to know. How do you feel about there being a sequel?
No, I agree. I think one of the things that frustrated me so much about this movie and frustrated me about Julie is that she seemed to not have any agency in this film. She has moments of agency, but on the whole, she doesn't assert herself. She doesn't make a lot of decisions. And so I am very interested in the second film to see what decisions she starts to make and what she starts to pursue now that Antony is no longer in her life. So I'm very curious to see where her journey goes, particularly as a filmmaker. Like, are you going to continue to devote yourself to your craft, and what does that look like, and who do you become out of this? Yeah, I'm very interested in seeing what they do with her character next.
Which usually we're not team sequel.
Oh yeah, no. Most of the time I am like, why? There's no need for a
Mm-hmm.
sequel. I got everything that I needed out of this. I don't need another one. You're just trying to make money.
Yeah.
And I don't feel that way about the Souvenir.
Yeah. Yeah. It almost feels wrong to call it a sequel. Like, dare we call it that term?
Yeah.
Because there's just so many loaded connotations with the word sequel, that it feels just like the second part to a story that could keep going on and on for this. It's just a person's life.
Yeah. Yeah. It does feel like the second half of a
Hmm.
whole story, you know?
Hmm.
Obviously, like they can be independent from each other, but it, I don't know, it feels like this one needs that second piece of it.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So I was pleasantly surprised by that. Uh, I'm intrigued to see where the Souvenir Part 2 picks up as well in from a time perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Is
Yeah.
this right after the aftermath of the ending of this movie, or has it been 2 years? Has it been 5 years? Where do we pick up from here? And I mean, it's a difficult task to continue this story and figure out how to frame where all those choices. I think will be illuminating and interesting to look at. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting.
Hmm.
And we're gonna find out in a week.
Yes. Yes. Because we're going to review it. I'm so glad we decided to. We were debating back and forth.
Hmm.
And yeah, after watching this first one, this seems like our past selves made some great choices.
Yes. I love that when that
Hmm.
happens. Thanks, past selves.
Yes. Okay. Uh, Other thoughts about the Souvenir before we wrap?
I Okay, I do have a question.
Yeah.
How did you feel about Anthony dying? Did you have thoughts, feels around that?
Yeah, I didn't expect him to die.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that at first. I was like, wait,
Yeah.
what?
Also, the
Um,
way that her mom tells her,
oh my
just the
goodness.
worst.
There's
Oh,
so
okay.
much in the relationship she has with her parents that I think
Oh,
could be unpacked,
yes.
but that would be a whole podcast episode.
You're not wrong.
Um, in a way, I felt relief, but I also think that like this is going to leave so much trauma for this young person who like she's no longer under the under his spell, under the effects that he has over her and the toxicity and all of that kind of stuff. But in some ways I think his absence and the fact that it ended here when she was still very much in love, very much on board with him, I think that the presence of that and is going to be in a way even larger for her to have to figure out how to deal with. And I almost think it's going to be harder for her to get over him because it was stopped at a point in time where she didn't see and experience all of the toxicity and the negative effects of it. So I'm like, man, like it's the Titanic effect, right? Like that ship sunk at the height of their love and affection for each other. And the fact that she's still so wrapped up in him and that's when he passes, I think is going to just I think it's going to be difficult for it to untangle from a lot of that. So I had mixed feelings because I'm like, oh, thank God this person's not going to have a hold on her anymore. But in a way, I think
Mm-hmm.
the absence of him and the timing of it's going to have, ironically, even a greater hold on her. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, no frustration. I hated it. Just for the reasons that you said, you know, I also wanted her to make the decision to have him leave. And I loved earlier in the movie when she's just like, please go. I was like, yes, girl, you can do it. Uh, but I wanted her to again assert that and go, nope, I don't need you in my life. I need you to leave and make that choice rather than that choice being made for her. And I feel similarly to you that him being taken suddenly and tragically out of her life uh, will have an immense impact on her, and even how she views past experiences. There's
Yes,
probably
yes.
that temptation to romanticize the past, and remember the good times, and her first love, or whatever, and maybe conflate it to something that it wasn't. So I was quite frustrated by the ending, but I think it does set up some really interesting character stuff for the second film. So I'm intrigued to see how they'll handle all of these really really complex emotions that Julie is definitely going through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Because there's never the catharsis for her, the revelation, the realization of how bad he was for her. And
Yeah.
now that he's not here anymore and cannot uh showcase, all of that and have that come to light clearly enough for her, in a way, that opportunity is entirely lost for her to actually see it clearly, because it was halted in its place. And so there will never be the catharsis of like, oh wow, like I didn't realize how bad it was, and I see now, and I need to walk away. And that's just, she's not going to have that moment because it was taken from her. Oh
Yep. It's
man.
rough.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
poor Julie.
I think also the fact that it's the way that he passed too, I think also
Mhm.
will shape and inform how she
Yeah.
sees him as well. It wasn't a freak car accident or something else. Like there's so many open questions that she'll have around his headspace and why he did it, and was it intentional? Was it not intentional? Was it just him going back to those old habits and going too far? Like, she's not going to ever know any of that. And those questions, man, will just eat away at you.
Yeah, and maybe even some guilt too, of
Yes.
like,
Ah.
yeah, I can see how that could just take you down a spiral.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oof.
Which is why part two is so warranted.
Right?
Yeah.
Man, and they can go so many directions and do so many things with part two, because she's at such a fragile and pivotal state when we leave her
Mm-hmm.
at the end of this film.
Yeah.
They can go a lot of directions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this was our review and discussion of The Souvenir. You can find it available to stream on Paramount Plus with the Showtime add on. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Movies and Us. Our name sums it up. We're all about movies and the powerful ways we connect with each other and the world around us. This podcast is about all of us and our shared stories. Everyone is welcome here, and we're so glad you hung out with us today. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you tune into your favorite shows. Drop us a review letting us know your thoughts about The Souvenir. You can connect with us on Instagram and Twitter at @MoviesAndUsPod, or email us at moviesanduspod@gmail.com. We will be back next week to discuss much anticipated Souvenir 2. Well, Souvenir Part 2, I think is the official name. We hope you have an amazing week, and we'll see you next week.